Hello, I'm Richard Wagaman. I'm going to be talking about a psychoanalytic study of Shakespeare and other pen names. Let me just mention that I've practiced psychiatry and psychoanalysis for more than 40 years, and for 18 years, I've been involved in researching and writing about Shakespeare and the question of who he was. So I'll begin with a justifiably famous line from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Walt Whitman captures in this disarming but profound quip a crucial dimension of the creative process for many great writers. This is their unusual tolerance for psychological complexity. This tolerance allows them to create convincing characters through a unique form of empathic mentalization, harnessing their unusual awareness and tolerance of multiple and sometimes contradictory self states. That is, different parts of the mind. I'll be saying more about that concept later on. The Earl of Oxford, who lived from 1550 to 1604, is thought by many of us to have been the writer behind the pen name Shakespeare. His mind systematically avoided the seductive trap of false binaries. This is in sharp contrast with the way most of us think, using compartmentalization and seldom holding and tolerating contrasting ideas in mind simultaneously. But Oxford subtly pushes us to expand the boundaries of our tolerance of conflict and complexity. Since we can only speculate about Oxford's psychological relationship with his various pen names and allonyms, which are names of actual people who did not write the work but signed their name to it, I will review the burgeoning literature on other writers who used pen names in the belief that their stories will better inform our speculations about the Earl of Oxford and his role in the work of Shakespeare. Stratfordians, that is, those who cling to the traditional legend that the merchant of Stratford wrote Shakespeare, seem to have become ever more dogmatic about their mistaken belief in recent years. Why is this so? It appears that they feel increasingly insecure and threatened. Cornered people can be dangerous, just like cornered animals. Roland Emmerich's 2011 film Anonymous introduced many people to the legitimacy of the Shakespeare authorship question. Evidence supporting Oxford's authorship keeps accumulating. Another, less widely recognized factor that must threaten the Stratfordians are the many recent books on anonymous authorship, especially a book by Penn State's Marcy North called The Anonymous Renaissance. It's a scholarly study of the frequency of anonymous authorship in the English Renaissance. Stratfordians have had to ignore the startling implications of her book for their authorship theory because it would pronounce a death sentence on their fatally misleading habit of being 100% certain that Shakespeare could not possibly be a pen name. They tend not even to engage with this question at all. Instead, they accept it as axiomatic, a form of pseudo-logic that accompanies the many logical fallacies of groupthink, where the conclusion is assumed to be true from the outset. You then reason backwards with unacknowledged circularity. This can lead to some comical results. For example, in the many bitter online debates with authorship skeptics, some Stratfordians defenders of the true faith splutter with unseemly rage about our theory that Shakespeare is a pen name, while refusing to use their own actual names in these debates. True. Ironic but true. One example among many is Nat Wilk, a false name seemingly used by Greer Gilman, a cataloger of polyglot books at Harvard. I'm going to tell this story in some detail because it illustrates the irony of people who hide behind false names in order to bully those of us who assert that Shakespeare is itself a pen name. So please stay with me. Nat Wilk harassed me with a vengeance after I published an article attributing a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses to the young Earl of Oxford. She critiqued nearly every paragraph of my article. Her central claim was that the word pairs I focused on in the translation that were not in the original Latin did not qualify as hendiadys, a particular form of word pair that was more common in Shakespeare's works than in the works of any other Elizabethan author. Instead, she made use of many alternative rhetorical terms, presenting herself as an absolute authority on the matter, speaking ex cathedra. In general, I have stopped interacting online with the so-called Ox frauds who attack those of us who believe the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare because I find that they only pretend to want a true dialogue. 2 years ago, Greer Gilman posted a review of one of my books in order to continue her argument about the Ovid translation. In addition to her lengthy and misleading review, she then posted over the next days several extremely wordy comments about her review. Finally, I replied, outing her actual identity. In terms of my topic of pen names, I wrote, quote, Greer hasn't yet told us why she's so coy as to her true identity when she posts online comments about the Shakespeare authorship debate. And she hasn't yet explained why it's inconceivable that the Earl of Oxford used a pseudonym when Marcy North made it crystal clear that the Elizabethan era was an age of literary anonymity, and when Greer uses a pseudonym herself. Inexplicably, after her frequent, lengthy comments on her review of my book, once I used her real name, Gilman fell silent for a whole month. Bullies are typically fearful people who quickly back down once they are confronted. Her sudden silence reminded me of that observation. After many comments in her defense by fellow Ox fraudsters, the formerly garrulous Gilman finally found her voice again. She said nothing about any of my comments to her, in contrast with her past claim that she wanted to have a dialogue with me. Enough. Now let me return to Marcy North's book about anonymous writers in the Renaissance. Anonymous authorship reflected elite and courtly conventions. Elizabethan earls risked losing their exemption from paying taxes if they violated so-called dérogations laws and published works of literature under their own name during their lifetime. Efforts to deny this stigma of print as it affected the nobility have been exercises in deception, giving examples that did not involve works of literature published during the nobleman's lifetime under their name. Marcy North quotes Robert Burton, the actual author of the 1621 Anatomy of Melancholy, a classic, explaining that Burton used the pen name Democritus, quote, to assume a little more liberty and freedom of speech. In her chapter called Ignoto in the Book Industry, North reports that two poems in the 1600 anthology England's Helicon were first attributed to Sir Walter Raleigh and to Fulk Greville, but cancel slips were glued over each name, and I've seen these cancel slips at the Folger Shakespeare Library, replacing each name with Ignoto, that's I-G-N-O-T-O. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to do that. Bednarz drew attention to the fact that two poems signed Shakespeare in the 1598 Passionate Pilgrim were re-attributed to Ignoto in the collection England's Helicon. Marcy North cites Ruth Huey's belief that Sir John Harrington had, quote, inside information about Oxford's authorship of a poem in the Arundel Harrington manuscript. North adds that Oxford's use of his initials when publishing some of his early poems, quote, combines the best of identity and discretion. She said that Lord Burleigh, that is, Oxford's guardian, after he was 12 and his father died, and then after he was 21, his father-in-law. Lord Burleigh is known to have published propaganda anonymously. In an article, North says Oxford's attributed work is so scarce because of, quote, the courtier's fashion of limiting readership through close manuscript circulation. Robert Griffin edited another scholarly book called The Faces of Anonymity. John Mellon and Carmela Ciuraru have also written excellent overviews of pen names, not restricting themselves to the Renaissance. Reading these books makes one aware of just how widespread pen names were since the Western invention of the printing press until the 20th and 21st centuries. Please keep that in mind. For example, more than 70% of English novels between 1770 and 1800 were published anonymously or under a pen name. 70% during that 30-year period. If there's any question at all about who wrote a given book, such a historical perspective prompts us to accept the possibility of a hidden author. In Brian Wildenthal's excellent book called Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts, he reminds us that John Davies published a poem called, quote, To Our English Terence, Shakespeare, and that significantly, Elizabethans joined Cicero in regarding the Roman slave and ostensible writer Terence as a likely frontman for the true ancient author. Stratfordians fail to mention that fact. A crucial factor in many cases of literary anonymity is the author's wish to distance herself from unbearably painful inner feelings. It is far more than simply a matter of keeping one's authorship secret from other people. It is vital for the psychological survival of some deeply scarred people to deceive themselves into thinking that their worst traumas happen to someone else, not to them. This dynamic is at the root of the creation of post-traumatic self-states, or well-organized mental structures that may have a dreamlike belief in being separate from the rest of the person's mind. In fact, it is our nocturnal self-states who dream our dreams. Think about it. How can we dream our dreams when we're asleep? We have separate self-states, like sociological theory of roles. We have separate self-states adapted to our work lives, to our friendships, to our sexual lives, to our aesthetic experiences, to our roles as parents and siblings, to learning a new language, and so on. Self-states created at different ages, starting in childhood, never fully disappear, but may recede into our unconscious minds, appear ghost-like in our dreams, and are sometimes reawakened by relevant later experiences. Previously well-adjusted women who are tragically raped, for example, commonly report that at the time it happened, they, quote, floated up to the ceiling and gazed down on that poor woman who was being raped. Or someone in a moment of terror hears a scream, only to realize it is their own scream. Such splits of one's identity into separate self-states can blunt the pain of trauma. Literary anonymity may help facilitate that defense for authors who use pen names or who leave their works unsigned. Further, a pen name itself may serve as a Rorschach-like ambiguous stimulus for the writer, reorganizing their sense of identity based on the projection of less conscious self-states onto the ink blot of their pseudonym. The Earl of Oxford's life of privilege turned upside down when he was 12 and his father died. His custody was then assigned by Queen Elizabeth to her principal secretary, William Cecil, who was ruthless in his pursuit of wealth, exploiting his power over his wealthy charge, the young Earl of Oxford. In our current global pandemic in 2020, just imagine what it was like for Oxford, having lost his father, only to live through the 1563 Plague of London where he now lived the following year, it killed nearly 25% of London's population. In his earlier childhood, Oxford lived in the home of his tutor, Sir Thomas Smith, one of the two greatest classicists of his age. Living later with Cecil, I believe Oxford turned some of his formidable intellectual energy back to the classics, translating Ovid's Metamorphoses, a translation that Ezra Pound called the most beautiful book in the English language, and I've given a YouTube talk on that translation. Livy, in his introduction to his immense history of ancient Rome, admitted he wrote it to escape from the troubles of his present era in later classical Rome. Similarly, translating Ovid probably had some escapist benefits for the adolescent Oxford. Aristocratic sprezzatura, or an appearance of nonchalance, would have helped him accept the necessity of putting his uncle Arthur Golding's name on the published version of Oxford's translation of Ovid, as he later signed a 1569 poem, A.G., using his uncle's initials. As I mentioned earlier, an allonym, and that's A-L-L-O-N-Y-M, is a sort of pen name which is the name of an actual person, such as Arthur Golding, used to deceive the reader about who the real author was. I've written that Oxford probably also used the name Thomas Brown when Oxford translated a work on rhetoric by Johann Sturm, S-T-U-R-M. I agree with those who believe E.K. in the Shepherd's Calendar was Oxford. Oxford probably wrote the Elizabethan poem signed Ignoto, which is the Latin and Italian word that means unknown. Some of us believe he also wrote the poems signed Anomos, A-N-O-M-O-S. Shakespeare, of course, is his best known pen name by far, but he used others, as did many other authors who used pen names. So let me now turn back to the psychology of pen names. Creative writers communicate with their readers on both conscious as well as unconscious levels. Unconscious communication is especially well suited to evoke states of emotional complexity in the reader. Writers often have an unusual degree of access to a range of their self-states, closely linked with emotionally charged implicit memories. This access, in turn, then allows them to stir responses in a corresponding range of their readers' self-states, including those to which a reader may otherwise have limited access. The use of a pseudonym may facilitate the process of symbolizing and organizing the various cognitive and affective or emotional states that contribute to literary creativity. I will now briefly summarize some relevant writings on the psychodynamics of self-states to help us understand how they may become organized for some writers with the help of a pen name. John and Helen Watkins, as early as 1976, posited that the normal structure of the mind includes a variety of ego states. That's what they call them. We now call them self-states. They defined an ego state as, quote, an organized system of behavior and experience whose elements are bound together by some common principle and which is separated from other such ego states by a boundary that is more or less permeable. Philip Bromberg later helped popularize the related term self-states. In 1994, Bromberg defined a self-state as, quote, an internally coherent aspect of the self with its own narrative, its own memory configuration, its own perceptual reality, and its own style of relatedness to others. He described the normal self as, quote, a multiplicity of self-states that, during the course of normal development, attain an aggregate experience of coherence that overrides the awareness of their discontinuity. Bromberg has written that, quote, a given self-state emerges at particular times within specific contexts. In its normal mode, each self-state retains fluid boundaries, allowing for easy informational exchange with the others. Under times of trauma, however, dissociation moves from its usual process function to a more structural one, in which self-state patterns of being become more rigidified and, more important, increasingly sequestered from one another. Sequestered, compartmentalized. To maintain a semblance of continuity, trauma experiences and their associated self-states become sequestered islands separated from and invisible to the other self-states, accessible to conscious attention at any given time. I know that's a mouthful, but self-states is a fairly unfamiliar term, so I want to give some background, show you how I think it's relevant to pen names. Bromberg also made the crucial point that, quote, the therapist's own immediate self-state almost invariably switches when the patient's does. The empathic stance of the psychoanalyst toward the patient's various self-states is relevant to the affective experience of the reader of a literary work. Bromberg wrote of the reader's identification with Arthur Conan Doyle's literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, quote, when a creative author is able to find language to embody in a piece of writing his own internal dialectic between normally incompatible self-states, such as, for example, horror and humor, he evokes a similar self-state disjunction in the reader. This offers us valuable insight into the psychology of our response to Shakespeare's plays and poems. One feature of great writing is the author's capacity to stir parallel, concordant responses in the reader to the emotional states depicted in the literary work. That process includes the influence of the author's self-states in the creative process, which then tap into corresponding self-states in the reader. So, let me now return to the exploration of self-states and pen names in creative writers. The rest of my examples will be from more recent writers who are more likely to use pen names for a range of internal reasons, rather than the external censorship and stigma of print that were big factors in the Renaissance. If we see pen names as a rare oddity, we will be less likely to think Shakespeare could have been a pseudonym. However, once we realize just how many noted writers use pen names, we might see things differently. I hope you will. Samuel Clemens' decision to take the pen name Mark Twain was the result of several impulses and defenses against them. In particular, it served as reparation to assuage the profound guilt he felt over the harm that he believed he had done to many people in his life, including a senior riverboat pilot who Clemens believed had earlier used the pen name Mark Twain. Clemens was so guilt-ridden that he claimed, quote, he spent the greater part of his life, which was one long apology, on his knees, begging forgiveness. That's from Justin Kaplan's wonderful biography. Clemens wrote that, quote, mine was a trained Presbyterian conscience, and knew but the one duty, to hunt and harry its slave upon all pretexts and on all occasions, particularly when there is no sense nor reason in it. Clemens is a humorous writer, even when he's writing about deadly serious matters. Clemens sounds like Dostoevsky's character Raskolnikov when he writes that, quote, so fine and so delicate was the perception of my guilty conscience that it often detected suspicion in the most purposeless remarks and in looks, gestures, glances of the eye, which had no significance, but which sent me shivering away in a panic of fright just the same. His writings portray him as having an archaic superego that can hound him mercilessly and excessively, but which he can also outwit at times. His pen name helped him address deep feelings of guilt and remorse. It allowed him to make reparation to the many people he felt he had harmed. Clemens seemed severely moody, if not bipolar. He wrote of the, quote, periodical and sudden changes of mood in me from deep melancholy to half-insane tempests and cyclones of humor. Kaplan writes of Mark Twain's chameleon identity as a writer and notes that Clemens explored his internal conflicts and sense of doubleness through the concepts of twinship, dual personality, multiplicity, conscience, and a dream self, what I would call a dream self-state. Clemens' self-hatred included a strong distaste for his public persona as a performing humorist. Quote, he was bound to be tormented by the distinction and the split, always invidious, between performing humorist and man of letters, and he had no way of reconciling the two. Susan Gilman writes, quote, "Dream analysis fascinated Mark Twain most of his life. The narrator of his short story, My Platonic Sweetheart, speaks of his, quote, habit of writing down my dreams and then studying them and trying to find out what the source of the dream is and which of the 2 or 3 separate persons inhabiting us is their architect." This is an eloquent anticipation of the psychoanalytic concept of self-state dreams. It is also a powerful statement of Clemens' fascination with dreams during his final years, when he deliberately spent much of his time in what he regarded as his dream worlds. He wrote in My Platonic Sweetheart of, quote, "the dream artist who resides in us." It is an equally forceful commentary on the author's awareness of some degree of inner multiplicity of self-states. This was written during an era when there was widespread interest in multiplicity, as exemplified by the publication of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Before turning to other writers, let me briefly mention a recent example of the Folger Shakespeare Library's twisted but typically Stratfordian version of scholarly honesty and objectivity. Pardon me if I sound too harsh. But listen, in 2016, the Folger Shakespeare Library exhibited the manuscript of Mark Twain's last book called Is Shakespeare Dead? Here are the final words of their poster next to this manuscript. Twain proposes that we don't know enough about Shakespeare to state unconditionally that he wrote the plays and poems attributed to him. But is Clemens fooling with us as he writes under his pseudonym Twain? It's hard to know. Hard for the Folger Shakespeare Library to face the truth is more like it. Please read that fantastic book, Is Shakespeare Dead? Mark Twain's final work. It's difficult to find because Shakespeare scholars have done their best to suppress it, including when Mark Twain's so-called complete works were published a few years ago. You can find it online. It's Shakespeare Dead. It's only 150 pages. It's hilarious. It's a hilarious book disputing the traditional theory about who wrote Shakespeare. And Mark Twain didn't choose another proposed author. He just said, there's no way that it was the merchant from Stratford. And by the way, I did have the pleasure and honor of being able to look through that manuscript one afternoon at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And one of the things I noticed is that Mark Twain, correcting the manuscript, is very careful to distinguish between the author's name Shakespeare and the different spelling of the man from Stratford, Shakespeare. Anyway, moving on. Pseudonymity has freed many authors from the self-censorship caused by shame or guilt. William Porter, for example, began writing under his pen name O. Henry while in prison, a fact he did his best to keep secret due to his deep mortification over having been convicted of embezzlement. The facilitating role of pseudonymity is likely to be especially salient when the content of the literary work is highly autobiographical in origin and addresses many issues about which the author is in significant conflict. Pseudonymity may help authors enact an unconscious fantasy of temporarily leaving behind their usual sense of self and merging instead with a more acceptable self-state that becomes their fictive narrator. The resulting distance from one's familiar identity may then open up a creative space that frees the author from psychological constraints that would otherwise silence him or her. It's all about writer's block. In his classic book, Identity, Youth, and Crisis, Erik Erikson remarked that, quote, trained minds of genius have special identity problems, often leading to a protracted crisis at the onset of their careers. I believe that if such a genius becomes a creative writer, one solution to such a crisis of identity is that chosen by the Earl of Oxford, to foster a degree of internal split between their past identity and their literary identity. Eras when pen names were common would naturally encourage a writer to choose this course. And of course, we know of current pen names too. Edith Weigert notes that Soren Kierkegaard used some 13 pen names for roughly half of his works, He signed the rest with his own name. Kierkegaard once explained that, quote, the pseudonymous writers are poetized personalities, poetically maintained so that everything they say is in character. Weigert speculated that, quote, his superego was split up into many ego ideals, eliciting the stormy crises of identity that Erikson describes. By the pseudonyms, he concealed himself in shame and yet was bursting out in defiant self-revelation. These aspects of Kierkegaard were in such severe conflict that he once published a book under one pen name, then turned around and gave it a scathing review under a different pen name. True story. Kierkegaard once gave a fascinating and poignant explanation for his use of pseudonyms, and I quote, due to my melancholy, I have not been able to say to myself, you, for many years, in the deepest meaning of the word. Between my melancholy and my you dwells a whole fantasy world. I have poured it partially into my pseudonyms. Like a person who does not have a happy home, goes out as much as possible and prefers to be out of it, my melancholy has kept me out of myself at the same time as I have traveled through an entire fantasy world, observing and poetically experiencing. Kierkegaard implies that his usual identity is an unhappy home. So he likes to visit alternate identities by writing under pen names. Kierkegaard's example illustrates the creative mixture of defensive and adaptive meanings of writing under a pseudonym. I would speculate that artistic creativity may be enhanced by the artist's use of one or more fictive artistic identities. The artist is thereby self-created, in the words of Shakespeare's Coriolanus, as if a man were author of himself. As Rittenberg and Shaw observe, and I've quoted this in an earlier YouTube talk, while the psychoanalytic literature does not explicitly discuss self-creation fantasies, artists have always been fascinated by them. This should not be surprising, since artists can create imaginary worlds whose apparent verisimilitude can rival our daily world's reality. Furthermore, creatively gifted individuals seem to possess ready access to unconscious fantasies, which can then be transmuted into conscious works of art. Erik Erikson writes of the, quote, various selves which make up our composite self. There are constant and shock-like transitions between these selves. Creative genius often depends on a certain flexibility and organization of the artist's identity, so that multiple self-states are able to operate with relative harmony, each contributing to the artist's creative work. And I think this is a big distinction between a well-adjusted, successful creative artist and the type of people who seek psychoanalytic help because of severe conflicts inside among their self-states. For many successful writers, using a pseudonym seems to help them forge a truce between the restraining forces of their personality and their impulses to express forbidden thoughts, feelings, and wishes. Even if their identity is known, they may still subjectively feel as though they are only acting a part when they write under the guise of their pen name. As Alex McNeill first informed many of us, Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, used more than 70 pen names, 70 pen names during his career. He thus represents something of an extreme example of this practice, and his comments on their meaning for him are especially intriguing. For example, Pessoa denied that they should be considered pseudonyms per se. Instead, he called them heteronyms, explaining that for him, each was a separate, real person. In a 1915 letter, Pessoa wrote, quote, I am an author, and have always found it impossible to write in my own personality. I have always found myself, consciously or unconsciously, assuming the character of someone who does not exist, through whose imagined agency I write. In a 1935 letter, Pessoa added, the mental organization of my heteronyms lies in my organic and constant propensity towards depersonalization and simulation. Ever since I was a small child, I felt driven to create a fictitious world around me and to surround myself with friends and acquaintances who never existed. Pessoa's father died when he was 5. He recalled creating his first non-existent acquaintance, Chevalier de Pas, when he was 6, just a year later. This illustrates the creation of a post-traumatic self-state in order to distance oneself from psychic pain, as well as illustrating an unusual variant of self-creation fantasies. Many writers seem to have non-conflictual cross-gender self-states. Pessoa demonstrated his comfort with a feminine identity in comparing himself to a mother who gave birth to his various heteronyms. He wrote that he felt his original sense of identity became overshadowed by his heteronyms. He said he knew his heteronyms were real, but he was not so sure about himself. He once said, "I'm the empty stage where various actors act out various plays." Richard Zenith, his translator, wrote to me of Pessoa's use of heteronyms. "It seems to me that he was a willing accomplice, like a mad literary doctor who decides to experiment on himself." That's a letter from 2007. Pessoa admitted that he, quote, "heard within me the discussions among his various heteronyms." There may be a non-pathological analog of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality that contributes to the unusual talent of some creative writers. A friend who is a best-selling writer told me her muse creates her work, and she simply writes it down. She is not the only successful writer who described this subjective experience of separateness from the self-state that is the inner source of creativity. Literary characters seem to possess an autonomous life of their own for many writers of fiction. Another example is the highly regarded novelist Anne Tyler, who said she hears her characters talking to her during her morning walks, which then contributes to what she writes later that day. In fact, of the 91 creative writers who described their creative process at the 2014 Edinburgh International Book Festival, 64 of them, roughly 70%, admit that they heard their characters speak aloud to them. I don't think that's well known, but it's interesting. As I have noted, creative people possess unusual access to the range of self-states that all of us have, but which are often unconscious. Just think of our failure the next morning to recall the dreams that were dreamed every night by our nocturnal self-states. Automatic writing may be the product of a self-state that is at some remove from the person's central identity. Regarding the journals kept by dissociative patients, reading the journals kept by dissociative patients regularly shows the emergence of self-states whose handwriting is distinctly different, as are their memories, emotional states, and sense of identity. The author of the 1954 pornographic classic, The Story of O, you didn't know I'd be talking about pornography, did you? Wrote under a pen name Pauline Réage. She said the first 60 pages of her novel flowed automatically, quote, "writing the way you speak, the way one breathes, the way one dreams." She later called the book a fairy tale for another world where some part of me lived for a long time. Fernando Pessoa did not consider himself to be a freak. Like Walt Whitman, he contended that, quote, "each of us is several, is many, is a profusion of selves. In the vast colony of our being, there are many species of people who think and feel in different ways." So you see, the notion of tolerance is important, not only tolerating people who are different from us, different nationality, different religion, different ethnic identity, but that concept of tolerance takes on new meaning with regard to our own identity, our capacity to tolerate the various aspects of ourselves. Another topic, isn't it? The philosopher William James agreed. He wrote in 1890 that, quote, "a man has as many selves as there are individuals who recognize him." Julie Phillips believes that, quote, multiple pseudonyms, like all the characters who spoke for Pessoa, can give voice to many sides of the self. It is a strategy for getting around self-censorship. John Mullen writes, there is no possible grand narrative of the changing conventions of anonymous and pseudonymous publication because, at any given time, there are different reasons for it. Or, as Siuraru puts it, the motives that lead writers to assume an alias are infinitely complex, sometimes mysterious even to them. She adds that many writers have been lonely outsiders, which is why inhabiting another self offers an intimacy that seems otherwise unobtainable. Isn't that fascinating? In the absence of real-life companionship, the pseudonymous entity can serve as confidant, keeper of secrets, and a protective shield. Mullen suggests that we are asking the wrong question if we assume anonymity is an all-or-none thing. Either-or thinking is one of the most common cognitive errors we all make. Mullen gives many examples of writers whose anonymity was partial in one way or another. He calls it, quote, a paradox we will find over and over again, the anonymous writer who does not truly attempt to remain unknown. I suspect that was the case for the Earl of Oxford, especially at court, where people would have known he was the writer of those plays and poems. Until the past century, a convention of authorial reticence dictated anonymity as a common course, even if paradoxically the goal was to stir up curiosity about the author's identity and eventually draw more attention to oneself. A first edition might be anonymous to test the waters. If critical and popular reactions were favorable, the author's name might appear on subsequent editions. The anonymity of many books gave way to printed attribution after the author's death. Many writers admitted their authorship freely to their friends, while some pretense of anonymity was maintained publicly. In still other cases of anonymity, the psychology of the author and the highly personal meaning of a particular publication seems central in their insistence that it remain anonymous. So anonymity is often partial. In 1850, Tennyson's poem In Memoriam was so well received that he was made poet laureate some 6 months after its publication. From multiple lines of evidence, everyone soon knew he was the author. But he insisted that all editions of that poem during his lifetime were printed without his name. He wrote in 1867, In Memoriam is an anonymous work and not to be meddled with. The poem was mistaken by one reviewer as expressing heterosexual love, since Tennyson's tenderness toward his dead friend A.H.H., who was actually Arthur Henry Hallam, was so effusive. One thinks of the parallel with the widespread, if false, belief that the first 126 sonnets of Shakespeare were written to a woman. They weren't. Tennyson's son reported, whoops, I've gotten ahead of myself, bear with me here, and I'm going to back up. I hit the wrong button on my computer. Here we go. Tennyson's son reported that his father did not originally write In Memoriam for publication. It would therefore have been an instance of writing for purely therapeutic purposes to help Tennyson deal with his severe grief, and that is often the case when poets write poetry, when any of us write poetry, because we're overcome with emotion. And that's even the theory of the origin of poetry in a Sanskrit classic. The first poem was written when someone was overwhelmed with emotion, and the Sanskrit words for poem and emotion were closely similar. One wonders if the loss of Tennyson's friend Hallam left Tennyson struggling with a grieving homoerotic self-state that conflicted with his largely heterosexual sense of identity, in addition to conflicting with his homophobic society. That conflictual self-state may have written the poem, so to speak. Tennyson seemed to accept the poem's publication only by telling himself it was now not about his personal feelings toward Hallam, but, quote, the voice of the human race that spoke through the poem. Anonymity can thus serve what John Keats called negative capability. Psychoanalysts know the value of listening to children. When I was once chatting with a 5-year-old daughter of friends of mine, I noticed a game nearby that was labeled Pretend Land. Oh, I told her on a whimsical impulse, that's where I live. She frowned momentarily. Then she conceded, you can't really live there, but you can pretend to live in Pretend Land. Play can be a serious matter for children. Like a role-playing child, the pseudonymous author ventures deeply into Pretend Land. Pseudonymity may help distance him from his usual sense of self, conscience, and social role, and may open up a creative space that frees the author from psychological constraints that would otherwise silence him. The Reverend C.L. Dodgson said of his pen name, Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, for 30 years I have managed to keep the two personalities distinct and to avoid all communication in propria persona with the outer world about my books. Marian Evans, also known as George Eliot, happens to be my favorite novelist, once wrote, I shall be resolute in preserving my incognito, having observed that a nom de plume secures all the advantages without the disagreeables of reputation. She kept writing under her pseudonym even after everyone knew who she was. Pen names often liberate authors from a wide range of inner and external restraints, preserving the autonomy of specific self-states in the process. In our narcissistic, self-aggrandizing era, we may project our own wishes for attention onto our forebears, blinding ourselves in the process to contrasting cultural practices in less narcissistic bygone eras. Ours is the age of plagiarism, the converse of anonymity. Think about it. Mullen calls anonymity this creative act of self-dispossession. Siyuraru finds that writers who use pen names tend to have survived profound trauma in childhood. Their pseudonym then reflects an alter ego that served as a kind of buffer, protecting them from the painful aspects of their lives, using her words. The use of a pen name is thus reminiscent of some Native American naming traditions that my wife Elizabeth Wagaman has described, where each person is given a secret name by a tribal leader, with the belief that a core part of the person's identity will thus be immune from the traumas of life. Anonymity blunts trauma. Great writers such as Oxford create fictional characters who come to life. It should not surprise us if writers who use pen names also create a fictive authorial identity, who in turn creates these literary characters. Such a self-state may facilitate the author's entry into the parallel world of her imagination, the wellspring of her creativity. Women who wrote under male pseudonyms are better known than the converse, that is, men writing as women. Mullen calls Pamela, quote, probably the single most influential novel of the 18th century. Its author, Samuel Richardson, initially passed it off as written by a young woman, the narrator herself. Similarly, Daniel Defoe initially claimed that his novel, Moll Flanders, was written by a woman. Alice Sheldon, what a story this is. Alice Sheldon wrote popular science fiction under the pseudonym James Tiptree, Jr. Julie Phillips' biography explains Sheldon's reason for writing secretly. Quote, like all interesting people, Sheldon had many sides or selves, and Tiptree gave her more room to be those selves. Many artists feel they have another persona who does their work for them, a secret self, very much unlike the me of their daily interactions. Her pen name, quote, helped Sheldon write simply because he was secret, James Tiptree. In anonymity, she felt safer to be herself. She quotes Sheldon as saying of her pen name, quote, what started as a prank dreamed its way into reality. What a sentence. Phillips believes that using a pen name allowed Sheldon to write for the first time based on, quote, an inner voice, as if someone else were telling the story. Good writing often involves the sublimation of forbidden impulses into a creative work. In the process, writers often show an unusual tolerance for self-states that are usually excluded from the person's conscious sense of identity. They can then face their pain from a viewpoint that is at some remove from their central sense of who they are. In many writers, we can see this as a sublimated and adaptive use of post-traumatic dissociation. As I have noted, I suspect that some form of unusual awareness and tolerance of multiple self states plays a crucial role for great creative writers like Shakespeare. Great authors tap into several of their own respective self states when they write. For Oxford, writing a play may have involved finding a self state that could identify with each of his characters, male and female. Writing under pseudonyms may loosen the grip of the author's central identity and activate a wider range of creatively accessible self states. Finally, in conclusion, part of the appeal of their literary work to the reader involves the activation and reorganization of some of the reader's less conscious self states with their associated memories and feelings. As Bromberg put it, this may promote a dialectic between normally incompatible self states. In response to such a dialectic in the literary work, the wide variety of intrapsychic and external dilemmas to which a pen name such as Shakespeare is an intended solution makes it clear that we will encounter a multitude of meanings as we learn more about a given instance of pseudonymity. If nothing else, I hope that after listening to this presentation, the next time someone asks, why would the Earl of Oxford have used a pen name, you can confidently reply, why not?